I'm Andy.
I'm Kieran.
And I'm Joe.
Today we want to know about what's open source got to do with AI.
That's right. We're going to talk about open source. So, for all you listening out there, that might be a term you've heard before. I know I certainly have. And I don't quite know what it means. I know a little bit about what it means for traditional software, but what does it mean for AI? We're going to get into that. So to talk a little bit about the plan for today's episode, let's talk about what open source is and what it is versus like proprietary AI. We're going to talk a little bit about open source history, and then what is good about having open source in the world and what is bad about it. And then we'll sort of end with how it affects you as users of AI and software. Sound okay?
Yeah,
let's get into it.
All right. So who wants to take a stab at defining what open source means?
Sure, I can take a stab at it.
And then I will re-explain it when Kieran gets too technical.
Yeah, there you go.
Great.
Well, highest level, open source is software that is free and available for anyone to use for whatever purpose they would like. If we get into more of the details, there are all sorts of different licenses. So if you think about like a logo that a company has, right? You can't just take that logo and put it on a t-shirt and sell the t-shirt. Someone owns that logo. So similarly with software, there are different tiers of licenses to indicate what can someone do with your software. That's a high
okay.
level.
I thought that was a great definition.
more literally, for losing you, all software is, all that AI is writing. Like literally the code is text files of like written lines of code. And usually companies will write this and then it's their precious secret. Like what is the code that's making their technology? But you could also just take that text and just like an ebook or whatever, just like put it online and let people copy it, let people edit it like a Google Doc.
That's right. And there's a few specific factors that make something open source that are worth talking about. It's transparent, so you can see what is actually the inner workings of it. You can look at the code and see. It's often collaborative, meaning that because it's open source, it means that anybody can contribute to it. This might mean like fixing a bug or adding a new feature, certainly suggesting improvements to it. Like y'all said, free to modify, free to distribute, and then often set with a certain license. And the opposite of open sourcing is having either like a closed source or a proprietary product. So this is going to be restricted, meaning sort of everything that's happening in the background cannot be viewed. As limited collaboration, the people who are building it are probably strictly on the payroll. No modification rights, very controlled distribution, and the licensing is going to be much strict. Let's talk a little bit about history. So open source doesn't strictly have to be software. There's examples of there being like scientific research that is considered open source, or creative works, or even like architecture projects. Again, those things would be like freely shared and available for others to replicate or do what they want with. But the term is really closely attached to software. There's a few sort of famous open source products out there. Like going way back, you may have heard of Linux or Apache. So these are like, how would we, who wants to explain those? Operating systems.
So if you think about Windows or Mac OS, these are operating systems that will operate all the things that you need to do on a machine, your laptop or a server. So there are also open source versions of these operating systems that you can download anytime, install on your computer, and then use that as your base operating system.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's important to take a moment to talk about open source is the GOAT. Nothing in tech would work without open source.
Yes.
Like, for example, Kieran just said, and Joe talking about operating systems. On your mobile phone, you have iOS for Apple, and you've got Android for all the other phones. Android is actually a limited open source. So Google makes Android, but Samsung can also use the Android operating system in their Samsung phones. Um, if you buy a MacBook, you get Mac OS. If you buy a Windows laptop, you get Windows. But if you're running a computer in the cloud, like a server, you don't want to pay for a license for these things. Plus, you want to get really nitty gritty into what's everything that's happening on this computer. So you're going to use a Linux open source distribution. And it gets really deep. Like every website you've ever visited uses open source. Somewhere in either how the images are being rendered or how the videos are being played, or every piece of technology you have ever used, every bit of hardware, every bit of software only works because there's open source shared technologies people collectively built or share, because otherwise none of it would work.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about like why a company would choose to go open source or like make their product open source, and then why conversely you would choose to keep it proprietary. So yeah, Linux and Apache are operating systems. So much has been built on them. It feels like a really good thing that they're open source. Other modern day products might be like Mozilla Firefox. It's a browser very comparable to like Google Chrome. WordPress, you may have heard of. The competitor to that might be like Squarespace, which you would have to pay for. Let's talk a little bit about like open source in AI. There are a few tools out there that are open source to help make AI. You may have heard of TensorFlow by Google and PyTorch by Meta. So these are important tools that the world is using to train AI. But those things aren't AI themselves or models that have been open source. But when we talk about the history of like AI going open source, it's important to mention those. A good example of a open source LLM, large language model, or piece of AI would be Meta's Llama. So unlike many other companies, Meta has made their big super performing LLM open source. Conversely, OpenAI has like ChatGPT, and even though earlier versions were open source, the most recent versions like ChatGPT 4 are actually closed source. What it means to take an AI model and make it open source is that the training and the creation of the model are essentially not open sourced. That includes all the training data that went into it, which is, millions, billions of data pieces, probably a lot of it like private and personal, that isn't shared externally. Only what is being shared open source is like the final product. And then you can take that product and you can go and build your own app with it. You can fine tune it, like change it a little bit, modify it, some of the things that we've already talked about.
When you have a model, we've talked about this AI models, there's code that puts the data and writes the rules for how this model should come into existence. This is training. And the output of that is something called weights. Basically, this is now all of the like magic, all the math, where it will take an input and make a predicted output. Often the file type for that is called a pickle file. I know that's really funny, but it's pickle. It's a pickle file. That's how weights are stored. And what Joe's explaining is like, all that gets open source is that black box of magic, the pickle file. Which you can take a pickle file and do other things with it, change it. But how you got to it is not open source. That's secret sauce.
Nice. So let's talk about why open source is good for the world. And there's a few points to hit here. So it encourages innovation and collaboration. Oftentimes, open source software is a community effort. Developers all over the world can contribute to it in some way, improving software, fixing bugs, adding features to it. There's often a cost savings, and Andy, you talked about this a little bit, but it means that for those who are building software, maybe at a smaller scale or like a small business or freelance. They can just build on top of something that already exists and they don't need to go rebuild it. And then also there's sort of an ethical aspect to it. It can be sort of audited and scrutinized by the world if you can see the code that went into it. It's not hidden behind, a wall where others can't see what's really going on. And there's a lot of benefits to that when it comes to like trust and transparency and safety. Can you all think of any other things we love about open source?
I just can't get past the fact that if open source doesn't exist, technology doesn't exist. Like, dead ass, there's no way any of us could do our jobs if it wasn't for open source.
Yeah, or it would exist, but software would be 1,000 times more expensive to create because you'd have to. Every person would have to customize or build their own thing, and a very basic example is like a database, right? In case you all haven't heard of a database, this is where any information that your software or technology is using will get stored in a database. And so anything you use has some sort of data storage layer under it. And if every single application you used had to go and write their own version of how data is stored, things would take, way longer to create or sell and would be way more expensive. So you can go download a version of SQL, which is a database that you can use in your application completely free, and it knows how to save data, it knows how to delete data, it has all these functions out of the box, so that you don't have to worry about that. You can go focus on, okay, well, what is the experience that I want to give to my users?
I think one more benefit maybe we haven't touched on is that a for-profit company is often going to make their products closed source, and that is a money-making effort, and therefore the product and its development is going to be driven by profit and not necessarily the human impact. Oftentimes an open source product is sort of its North Star is to make it the best possible thing for humanity, and obviously there's benefits there. So something to keep in mind.
And one thing that's interesting about this is open source is not a zero-sum game. So when we traditionally think about like economics, you can't open source a diamond mine because there's a finite amount of diamonds and somebody wants to own them, right? But that's not the case. You can copy software forever. Like, think about it. If you ever used Napster, and I hit with one of those commercials about like, would you download a car? Well, if all a car took was download, of course you'd download a car. You could download infinite cars, 10 cars for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like in Star Trek, right? Like if you've got the replicator, you can replicate as much as you want. It doesn't matter how much everybody has. That's software. It costs nothing to one person if their stuff is copied, right? Mm-hmm. If you are selling something and somebody copies it and undercuts your price, that cost stuff. But like if I am using software that shows my browser how to render video because I'm making Netflix, it doesn't hurt me at all if YouTube also uses software to render video, and so does some kid on Roblox making his own game,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But I will say this can get complex very quickly. Because as we start talking about AI and open source, while the code is free and you can take it and do whatever you want all day, it's actually very expensive to run and manage a lot of these tools. And so, even outside of AI, there's a lot of companies that will have an open source version of their software where it's like, here, this is the whole thing, do whatever you want with it. But to actually run it and make it functional is, in some cases, not easy, right? And so they'll also offer an enterprise version of that software where it's like, it's the same software that you're running from open source, but now they have a whole bunch of tools, security, maintenance, and things below that they are doing to make this run, in an enterprise environment, so that now, hey, I'm building an application and I have 1 billion people that need to use this. that management, maintenance, etc., is non-trivial, and that's where you're going to then pay for that.
Yes.
And we also say you kind of get what you pay for. So open source stuff is incredible, but you're on your own if it breaks. And it will. Tech breaks. That's just, everybody's lived it. If you've used a computer, you've seen it break. So like, that's one of the reasons why, like just like Kieran said, companies will give their stuff away for free. It doesn't actually hurt their business at all, because if anybody's going to have real volume and usage on it, they're going to be like, well, I need help. And then they'll pay.
Yeah. A good example of this is actually Red Hat Linux. Their whole business is giving away their product as an open source product, so for free. But there's an entire business around support and broadly support and sort of enterprise assistance. And that actually takes us into let's talk a little bit about the downsides of open source. And we've touched on some of these, but there are security risks. So if open source code is publicly available, then malicious actors can actually go get a really close look at it and understand how to exploit it.
And this has happened. So example of this, the Node.js vulnerability last year, I think, and some other things. Basically, if every bit of software you use on your phone and your computer and your TV uses the same open source package somewhere, and somebody finds a hole in it, that hole now exists in everything you do. So that's why every now and then the entire internet breaks or shuts down, or you see everybody making you reset your password all at once. It's because a very popular package was exploited, and we realized that that mistake is copied over 100 times.
It also creates a breeding ground for misinformation and misuse. And I think this one's very pertinent to AI in particular. You can imagine you have a very performant model like Meta's Llama. And if someone can just go and grab that and sort of fine tune it and make it different, they now have a very powerful model that is fine tuned to do something bad. For example, maybe, lean heavily on instructing people to make weapons, that sort of thing. Deepfakes also. There's certainly maintenance challenges. We've talked a little bit about this, but if these projects rely on maybe volunteer labor, or there's sort of a lack of a centralized organization guiding the product, then it becomes a lot more challenging to maintain it and make it sustainable. Similarly, there's this idea of fragmentation where an open source project may get released, but then people start forking it or making copies of it, and they sort of all go their own way. One goes left, one goes right. And then suddenly the global population has a product out there that has many different versions that all do very different things and maybe don't work well together. So that is certainly a risk.
If you are in the software world, whenever you're using some big open source, if open source components are a large part of what you're building, there's trouble. You have to explain all this to lawyers, and then they're like, but how are we going to defend our intellectual property? And you're like, oh, good Lord. But this really means, let's say the three of us were building something that we think is really cool. And Kieran finds the open source package. I take a look at the license and it looks good to me, and we build it. We spend 6 months building, and then a lawyer comes back to us and is like, oh, if you use this, you have to put their logo instead of your logo. It says right here in the license. We're like, oh no. We just spent 6 months building on something we can't actually use, that has all of its own habits and formulas and patterns. Now we have to pull it out and put something else in. It's painful when that happens.
Yeah, definitely read the license before you spend too much time doing something with a piece of software.
Anyone else have any thoughts on the negative impacts of open sourcing?
Honestly, it's about to get fucked. That's why I assume where you're heading. Laws around software barely understand phones. How are they ever going to understand AI? And when their conflicts arise between... Okay, this could get cut into the episode. Facebook, aka Meta, made this awesome free giant model that can do so much called Llama. And they put it up and they open sourced it with a special license they made called the Llama Community License. And right now, the Llama Community License says that anybody can do anything they want as long as they say it's a llama model, and they have less than 100 million monthly active users. So they're basically saying, as long as you're not one of our big competitors, a big social media platform, you can do whatever you want with this. Also in that license, it says they can reserve the right to change the Llama Community License whenever they want.
Red flag.
So you could build a business off of this. If your business gets too successful, all of a sudden you don't have permission to use the core technology anymore. Or at any point, they could change the rules on you. So we're a couple years away from these kinds of complications ending up in the courts. And I don't understand how judges, bless their hearts, are going to understand what's happening, what's being copied, and what it means downstream.
Mm-hmm. However, I think there's like precedent here. Right now, I know there have been court cases on like Apple's behavior with their paid walled garden of apps. And it's sort of the same thing. They probably had lower barriers to making iOS apps in the beginning, but slowly over the years have eroded, made that barrier higher or like harder to exit, or took more fees from these app builders. It was basically Apple's play into like making money off of all these apps that they had gotten into their walled garden. We'll probably see the same thing in the future where maybe there are things that look truly open source now, but there are these sort of fine print rules that are going to chip away at that. So hopefully that precedent will help make some of those decisions. This kind of leads me to, I was very curious about why a for-profit company would choose to go open source versus closed source. And we've talked a little bit about this, but I looked into it a bit. And there's some good reasons. So one would be rapid adoption, meaning if something's free, it might get a lot more users a lot more quickly versus something that you'd have to pay for. So it sort of can be a way to inject yourself in the market and really take off quickly. It allows a for-profit company to lean on the global developer community, meaning free labor. So if they create something cool and they want others to take it and run with it, they don't have to pay those other people to do it. There's a lot of excitement around it. Kieran, you talked about this, but just brand recognition and trust. It makes, the for-profit company look like it has a commitment to openness and collaboration and transparency, which is a reputation builder. We talked about monetization through related services. So basically, you release the product for free, and then you make a business out of supporting it.
Let me give an example for people of when something open source is a huge moneymaker for a business. If some of us have Apple phones, some of us have Android phones. More and more people are getting Android phones. Sorry about it, Kieran. Cute.
Sorry, Kieran. Sorry.
And Google gives away the Android operating system to all different kinds of phone manufacturers, Xiaomi and Hisense and all different companies around the world. If they don't want to build an operating system for the hardware phone they are making, they can use Google's. But if you're on an Android phone, you have to use the Google Play Store, not the Apple App Store. And so then this is a scheme, a Google scheme, right? If I am now making a fun game about cats gardening, fun fact, a game that really exists that I really like that I play on Android. Fun game about cats gardening. And I think I need to pick a platform to make this game for. And it's different if I code it for Apple versus Android because they have different rules in the coding system. Well, if more people are using Android, then I'm more likely to build my game first for where there's more people and put my game maybe only on the Apple Play Store. So it's a way, if Google gets more people using Android on more phones, more developers will prioritize the Google Play Store, and that's Google saying, fuck you, to Apple.
Mm-hmm. It's the same playbook that kind of happened with Microsoft for Mac OS. Basically, if you wanted a Mac computer, you had to pay for it and its operating system. But if you're like me, you remember the days when everyone was using PC. It was all PC. And that's largely due to the fact that Windows was, it came on all sorts of devices, not just devices created by Microsoft, which I don't even think they ever created devices for that time period.
Although now your Mac OS is free. You can download the latest version anytime.
But can you put it on any hardware?
You could
Not. It's called a Hackintosh.
Yeah, you have to hack it.
Hackintosh.
Yeah, you can. You're not supposed to.
Yeah, but I think there was something in the early days. The fact that you couldn't easily put Mac on any piece of hardware meant that the software you could put on any hardware, i.e., Windows, really took off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is where it starts to get really complex, right? Because the reason why you can't just download the latest version of Apple's OS and put it on anything is because it also matters what hardware it's on. And so we can get all the way into technical, but basically similar to Google versus Apple, like these underlying systems have certain ways that it understands how to read a piece of software. And so that's where you would have to hack it, right? So I can get the OS from Apple, but I have to change some stuff before I can put it on a device that's not an Apple device.
Yeah.
It's like you can't roll, into the gas station and then decide, am I getting diesel or am I getting 84 or 87? There's some stuff, a decision you made when the time you bought the car that changes what you can get downstream. Mm-hmm. That doesn't matter what cool updates they make on diesel, you can't put it in your car.
Yeah. Well, you can, but you'll pay for it.
It's not a good idea.
There's two other reasons why a for-profit company might go open source. It allows them to drive industry standards. We sort of have addressed this, but basically, if you become very quickly like the power player in the field, then you can define what everyone else should do. And this sort of, I think that example of like an app store, Andy, is kind of like this. Like, this was Google's play to have people build Android apps because they basically made it easier and more desirable to build for Android, thanks to its open source product. And then lastly, there's also something to be said for like recruitment and talent acquisition. So if you're a good human being and you want to help the world, you might be more excited to go work for a company that has open source stuff out there versus closed source, because they're doing something that has more potential to benefit humanity.
And this is important for a lot of developers. Like, I have engineers on my team who are maintainers and have commitments to certain open source projects that they're passionate about. And it's like they don't want to work at a company where they don't have permission to spend a little bit of their time working on these open source projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, talking about from the end user perspective, right, for all of you listening, there are going to be a lot of different ways that you're going to be able to interact with these things. And so just because something isn't open sourced doesn't mean you can't use it for free, right? Andy mentioned Google searches. Your Google search is using Gemini. And when you see the little summary that shows up at the top of your Google search, like that is coming from Gemini, and you're not paying anything to actually see that summary, right? And so technically you're using one of these LLMs for free anytime you do a Google search. But the caveat is you can't do more than Google's allowing you to do, right? So the only way that you can use that model for free is like running a Google search and getting whatever it gives you. Versus ChatGPT, where it's like I'm paying it, but now I can have a whole conversation with it. I can generate images. I can like do all this other stuff that Google doesn't allow me to do just for free. And then on the flip side, with Llama's open source, you can take the model, you could do whatever you want, but you're going to have to pay for the server cost to run that model, which is not cheap at all. And so there is like a whole spectrum, from the end user perspective of how you're going to be able to interact with these things. And that's actually why I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where it's like the one AI, because of there's such a wide range of how people want to and are going to interact with these things, that there's always going to be some use case or some need in the market for each of these different types of interactions.
Mm-hmm. Competition is good for markets. Mm-hmm. We have arrived at a conversation about capitalism, which means it's time to wind down the episode.
Yeah, I was about to go off the rails again.
You want to go for it, Andy? What do you
have for everybody listening knows exactly what I think.
Any closing thoughts?
I think the law is going to have a hard time keeping up with AI. So I haven't actually checked if Newsom has signed the new AI ethics bill in California, but I'm personally not a huge fan of it so far, because from what I understand, we talk a lot about AI being a tool, right? And it's legal to use a shovel to make a garden, and it's illegal to use a shovel to hit somebody on the head. That makes sense to me. The AI ethics law or bill was written so that instead of talking about what you can do with the shovel, it talks about what the people growing the tree that makes the handle and the shovel should be doing, which to me is a dumb way to write regulations. And like it's just going to get messier. Once people start really seeing a lot of value and there's all these products and cool tools that people are figuring out, and you're just using AI every day, we're getting, some people are already there, but it's going to just happen more and more. And there's money to be made. There's going to be a lot of finger pointing where there's not clear precedent legally. There's not clear outcomes or inputs legally. It's going to be confusing. Mm-hmm. It'll be a fun ride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, TLDR, we are literally in the Wild West of AI right now.
Yeah.
So there's no rules. People are trying to come up with rules, and we definitely need to do an episode on AI policy. Not AI and policy, but policy about AI.
Yeah.
But I think we're not even at a point. Anything we say in that episode is just going to be speculation at this point. There's a long way to go before even the engineers or the people building this are going to know how to manage this in the future.
Yeah. I think they're totally right. Like, we're in the Wild West in terms of like policy defining AI, but I also think we're in the Wild West or early stages of like how we're even going to use AI. Like, I don't think we have yet seen the explosion of products that are coming. And will they be driven by closed source proprietary models, or will they be driven by open source? We'll find out.
Well, folks, thank you again for listening to another episode of AI FYI, your friendly neighborhood podcast, where we take various ideas, look at different industries, and try to understand how AI is going to impact our lives today and in the future. So make sure to like and subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform, Apple Music, Spotify, and leave us a comment and let us know, what do you think AI is going to do in the future? And have you interacted with an open source AI ever?
Bye.
See ya.